Coming up on American Black Journal, I'll talk with the author of a new book about Detroit's major influence on jazz in America. Plus, a new PBS show delves into the history of this country through the lens of family photo albums. Stay right there. American Black Journal starts now.
MASCO Corporation is proud to manufacture innovative and environmentally friendly products for the home. Delta faucets, craft-made in Merillat cabinets, and Behr brand paints have all been designed with you in mind. MASCO and its family of companies, serving Michigan communities since 1929.
Support also provided by the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, a partner with communities where children come first. The Cynthia and Edsel Ford Fund for Journalism at Detroit Public TV.
The DTE Foundation proudly supports 50 years of American Black Journal in covering African American history, culture, and politics. The DTE Foundation and American Black Journal, partners in presenting African American perspectives about our communities and in our world.
Also brought to you by Ally, Nissan Foundation, and viewers like you. Thank you.
Welcome to American Black Journal. I'm Stephen Henderson. Detroit is well known for being the birthplace of the Motown sound, but the city also has played a major role in the formation and progression of jazz. A new book by local writer Mark Stryker tells the story of Detroit's influence on jazz in America. It's titled Jazz from Detroit. I sat down with Mark to talk about the city's incredible jazz history and the Detroit musicians that made a profound mark on modern and contemporary jazz.
Without Detroit, jazz would not be the same. And what's particularly interesting about jazz from Detroit is the way in which the social, cultural, sort of economic factors of the city produced this explosion of jazz talent at mid-century. And then over the course of the next 60, 70 years, we have continued to produce graduated great musicians to the national scene, even as the economic power of the city has declined and the population has declined. So there are interesting reasons for that, and that's part of the trajectory of the book too.
Jazz, of course, does not start in Detroit, but it comes here pretty early. And talk about jazz sort of taking root in Detroit, as you say, in the middle of the century, why that happens, and sort of the contribution that the city makes to the art form.
Well, the first thing to remember is that we in Detroit were one of the great beneficiaries of the Great Migration that brought hundreds of thousands of African Americans to Detroit in the first half of the 20th century. And so jazz, as a cultural expression of African Americans, becomes very early on becomes central to the city. But in the middle of the 20th century, what happens is you have a confluence of incredible public school music education programs where kids really get great formal education in music. Remember, our schools were integrated here, and Cass Tech in particular was kind of an arts magnet school, very high level music education. And you combine that with some key mentors in the community, and now we're talking about the great jazz pianist Barry Harris, who taught several generations of musicians here in the 50s, including very important names like Donald Byrd and Curtis Fuller and Paul Chambers and Yusef Lateef and Charles McPherson, and all of these people came up under Barry Harris's wing. And you combine that formal education with the informal education of Barry Harris in an environment of a thriving nightlife, which has been fueled by the auto industry, offering some of the best paying jobs for African Americans in the country. That is a powerful combination of elements and really leads to this explosion of modern jazz in the middle of the century.
Your book is broken down across sort of time periods in some way, but the real power of it is these individual stories about these jazz musicians who, even if you know their names, there's stuff in there that you learn that you didn't know about sort of how they came to the art, the way they influenced the art, and the way that collectively they became this sort of Detroit sound and Detroit jazz, which then influences everybody else.
Yeah, the core of the book is basically these 25, 26, 27 substantial profiles that try and give a portrait of these musicians from here, both on the bandstand and off the bandstand. And so we're talking here now about people like Hank Thad and Elvin Jones, the great brothers from Pontiac. Hank was a pianist, Thad a trumpet player and a composer and arranger, and Elvin Jones, the great drummer who came to fame with John Coltrane in the 1960s. So, I mean, right there, you've got probably the greatest single family in jazz history.
Right here in Southeast Michigan.
Right here, and you know, they came of age in Detroit, and specifically when you talk about Elvin and Thad, they were part of a scene around the Bluebird Inn, which was kind of the epicenter of modern jazz here in the 1950s on the west side, on Tireman. And they were part of a house band there that was as great as any of the music happening in New York at the time. And so that's there are many individual stories in the book about players like that, about the great bass player Ron Carter, who sort of comes to fame with Miles Davis in the 1960s, and we trace his life from, you know, growing up, going to Cass Tech, wanting to be really a classical, wants to be a classical cellist, and he realizes at a certain point at Cass Tech that he's not getting the calls for the gigs that the white players
kids are getting.
Right? And so he switches to bass, and then he goes to Eastman, and he's studying to be a classical bass player. And the great Leopold Stokowski, the conductor from Houston, comes to conduct the Eastman Rochester Philharmonic. And he says at one point, he pulls Ron aside and he says, you know, Mr. Carter, I would love to have you in my orchestra in Houston, but they are not ready for a colored bass player in the orchestra. And Ron is, my God, I spent all this time, okay, what music can I play and have a good time doing it? And it's really at that point that he shifts into jazz and he becomes this highly influential bass player. And so so that's an example of the trajectory that we kind of try and tell in the book.
Of course, you can't talk about jazz in Detroit without talking about the venues, which were key in the 50s and 60s, but many of them are still really prominent now in terms of the way that they perpetuate that legacy.
Well, the music it's a live art form. I mean, records are a snapshot and they're important, but the music really survives only when it can be performed live in front of an audience. And one of the things that's really important about jazz from Detroit and in Detroit is that we have some of the best audiences for this music in the country. You talk to musicians, they will tell you this is the most knowledgeable, respectful, nurturing audience that there is. And they've always been that way. I have stories in the book, Joe Henderson, the great saxophone player, talking about coming up here in the 50s and saying how, you couldn't get up on that bandstand jiving. Because people would let you know. And yet at the same time, so we have very high standards here, and we still have very high standards here, and those are sort of nurtured in the club. But it's also a very nurturing audience, and the scene is very nurturing. Regina Carter, the great violinist, says in the book, this community raised us. And when she says community, she's talking about her mentors, like Marcus Belgrave, the trumpet player who taught so many kids in more recent decades. But she's also talking about the way in which the community, particularly the African American community, still embraces this music. Jazz is social music, and it's social music in Detroit in a way that it is not now in many cities across the country. And I think you feel that when you're out in a club here, if you're at Cliff Bell's or you're at Baker's or at the Dirty Dog Jazz Cafe or wherever it may be, you can feel that that audience that is right there on the bandstand with the musicians, and that's not something you get in every city.
Yeah, there's an ownership of the art form here, I think, among audiences that you don't feel in other places.
Yeah, very much. We're proud of our jazz musicians here. I mean, we're proud generally of music here, right?
Yeah.
And so it's jazz, it's Motown, it's the Belleville 3 and techno, it's the MC5 and Bob Seger, and it's classical musicians like Ida and Annie Kavafian, and so music generally is revered here in Detroit, but jazz in particular is this extraordinary expression of African American culture. I think is particularly is part of our DNA here.
Yeah, you know, of course, jazz is different now than it was even when I was a kid in the 70s here in the city, when you had, you know, WJZZ, which played in my father's house 24 hours a day. It was that sort of constant connection with it that, you know, that shaped his life, but then also shaped mine, right? So that I grew up thinking that this was music, that was what music was. How does it survive today in the same ways, or how is it perpetuating itself given all the changes in the industry, given the changes in popularity for art forms like jazz?
Yeah, big question.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the issues we face in the music today is there was a point at which jazz was more part of common culture. Yeah. You heard it on the radio, you saw it in Time magazines, you saw it on Johnny Carson. I mean, it was part of the conversation in a way that it is not so much today. In Detroit, we have it better than in most places, because it's still, because of these things that I've been talking about. The venues and how deeply rooted it is in our DNA, it is still part of common culture for lots of people. It could be better, but still. I think one of the things that's interesting about if you look at some of the younger jazz musicians here, you know, there's a really strong culture of mentorship in Detroit that has perpetuated this music over the decades. That's a really major theme in the book. In the 1950s, it was Barry Harris who was teaching, and in more recent decades, Marcus Belgrave, the late Marcus Belgrave, the trumpet player, who came up with Ray Charles and Max Roach and many others, it was Marcus who really took so many young musicians, including the bassist Bob Hurst and the bassist Rodney Whitaker and the pianist Jerry Allen and the drummers Kareem Riggins and Gerald Cleaver and Kenny Garrett, the saxophone player, and Regina Carter, and all of these musicians came up under Marcus's wing. And he breathed the music into their lives. And so when you talk about, well, how did the music regenerate itself? How does jazz regenerate itself? In Detroit, mentorship is crucial.
Is everything. And of course, we can't talk about jazz in Detroit without mentioning the Detroit Jazz Festival, which will take place over Labor Day weekend. It's the largest free jazz festival in the world, and we'll have a preview of this year's festival right here on American Black Journal later this month. Coming up, using family photos to explore United States history and diversity. But first, here's a 1981 Detroit Black Journal interview with musician Barry Harris about Detroit's jazz scene.
I used to go stand in front of the Bluebird and see the bandstand was in the window. And so the pianist, a fellow named Phil Hill, who was, you know, pretty good pianist for us to hear, he would see me and then he'd jump up from the piano and I'd run in and play a tune and I'd run back out and wait for the next set. And then I'd run in and play a tune and run back out. I celebrated my 21st birthday in the Bluebird. I made sure that they knew I was 21, you know, even though I had run in there for years, you know, like quite a lot, you know. So then you know, the Bluebird was like a magical kind of place. I call it magical because it was about the only place in the world where it closed at 2 o'clock and 1:30 if Sarah Vaughan or somebody would walk in, an empty place would suddenly be full. So it was like really magic.
A new three-part PBS series explores America's history, diversity, and common values by looking through the pages of family photo albums. The show is called Family Pictures USA, and it airs on August 12th and 13th here on Detroit Public Television. One of the episodes is based in Detroit, and it focuses on the descendants of slaves and Native Americans whose ancestors helped build the city. The program's executive producer, Don Perry, spoke with One Detroit's Will Glover.
The real reason why we came to Detroit was because Detroit, throughout its history, has always been a leader in terms of what's coming next for the rest of the country. It's like a bellwether. And so we thought, if you really want to understand America, come to Detroit.
Right. So that said, how do you find the particular stories that, we get to follow in the first episode of the people? Is it just through, people bringing their photos to you, or do you go and search for that?
It's a combination of things. So we started a process roughly 6 months before we began filming here in Detroit to research the history. And in the course of doing that, we had a lot of input from people here at the Historical Museum, as well as at Wayne State University. We read a lot of books. We looked at a lot of newspapers and magazines. And part of what our research is looking for, not the bold-faced name kind of people,
right,
but looking for those little stories that would get overlooked. So whereas we have great newspapers here in Detroit, our research focused on the smaller newspapers.
Right.
We would go into the neighborhoods, we would get the little throwaway things by the cash register or just as you're coming out the door, and we'd see who's in that. Because those people are being highlighted by folks just like them within their own communities as people that they recognize as leaders or are doing something that's positive. And that's the other thing. We're not looking for sensationalism, we're looking for the positive. We're looking what can we learn that's going to be aspirational or uplifting. And so part of our research, as we were going through all those little things, we'd see these little names. And we kind of reach out to them and see, would you be interested in telling your story? What's your family connection to Detroit? And then, of course, that's how we kind of found the main characters. And there are about 5 main characters.
Right.
Everyone else, though, we did a series of what we call community photo sharing events. Those community photo sharing events are kind of a come one, come all. We were in 7 different locations around the city.
Wow.
We invited people to come to museums, libraries, churches, and share with us 10 to 15 minutes their images and stories that meant the most to them. That's all we said to them. Bring those images, those stories that mean the most to you. We then kind of going through and listening to all of that material. I mean, and we probably had, on average, 150, 175 people come to those events. We kind of noticed patterns, and we noticed things that then became the thematic elements for the show. And then we used those personal testimonies to flesh out and provide nuance for those major themes.
Right.
So the ultimate show, Family Pictures USA Detroit, It's the Future and It's Okay, looks at Detroit as from a framing device, going through historically its evolution from frontier town to what it is now,
Right.
but through the family stories that kind of augment Native American history. What's happening with newcomers and immigrants to the community, the contributions of African Americans to building Detroit, Detroit's music history, but not in the way that it's typically told.
Right.
We want the people that are underneath that, or the people on the side that we kind of go by and and nobody really focuses on.
Not just we're going straight to Motown, we're going straight to Barry and
Right.
Stevie and...
Right. I mean, so we went to Universal Sound Studios. We went to we got at Aretha through Joe's Record Store. We looked at histories that people are sitting on that are really interesting stories about Detroit and what makes it special, but you're not going to read about it in a Detroit Free Press, sadly.
Right. So
or
is
something like
that the overall goal of the project, is to illuminate history and stories that would otherwise be overlooked?
Absolutely, because history's curated, right? And it's curated by certain people that have been given certain authority by someone that that is the official history.
Right.
We're not interested in that. That's a jumping off point, because all of that started with certain biases and predispositions that left out whole swaths of history of people who were here contributing and making things, but because they didn't fit a particular narrative, or because they didn't, they weren't part of the in group, they were left out. And so that's the history that we're interested in. And that history hasn't really been explored. And if it is explored, where you're going to find it? It's in those family narratives and those family stories.
So we're talking about photos, people bringing in historical pictures that mean a lot, and oftentimes they're physical copies, but we live in a day and age where there are billions of photos taken every single day and uploaded every single day. So how does that impact what you're doing?
Actually, we did a film called Through a Lens Darkly, Black Photographers and the Emergence of a People. That film was about black photographers and their use of the camera as a tool for social change. And in that film, we interviewed over 50 photographers, and we looked historically all the way back to the very beginning of photography. Jules Leon was a free man of color in New Orleans who happened to be in Paris and saw Louis Daguerre demonstrate the daguerreotype, and he brought that technology back with him to New Orleans, becoming what we think is the first photographer, professional photographer in the US.
Oh, wow.
It's histories like that that film focused on. And because they were black photographers, by and large, a lot of their archives really weren't collected.
Right.
And so Deborah Willis, who's an eminent photo historian and in the history of black photography in particular, had written several books about these people to shine a light on their images and the work that they were doing. When we went to look at some of those images, or look for some of those images, a lot of that were in family photographs, because those black photographers captured something. They captured the black family throughout history. So going all the way back to the 1850s and all the way forward to today, black photographers were capturing a slice of this country and its history that you couldn't find in the Life magazines, or you couldn't find in the archives of major places. And so it was the process of making that film that led us into searching family photos and family archives to highlight and bring those photos forward, that led us to this journey that ultimately results in Family Pictures USA. The motivation to take a photograph today, whether it's digitally or back in the old days with an actual camera, hasn't changed. The point of it, as Leopold Senghor said, is to capture one person's, or to basically link one person's eyes to another's heart. We capture people that we love, moments that are cherished, that we cherish, that are important to us. That motivation has never changed. Even the selfie, that horrible malign thing, right? We're trying to capture an instant that makes us feel good. So when we extract individual images, regardless of how we do that, whether they're the physical artifact or they're digitally, we're extracting those moments. And then it's the frame or the context that we put them in that gives that meaning. What we're doing in this project is kind of twofold. One, we want to create a frame that says, look at us, aren't we special?
Right.
And the second thing we want to do is to get people to realize that these images are just as important to our social and cultural history collectively as they are to those individual families or to that individual person in terms of the archive that they're creating.
That kind of leads me into my next question. When it comes to the photos and the importance of them, and again, you've said you have a large amount stockpiled. What are some similar themes that you've seen? Because a big part of this is you have people from a huge diaspora all across the board, but there has to be some sort of common thread that you can pick up on.
It is. We're human. We're human beings. And the people that are important to us are the same regardless of our ethnicities, our background, our gender, our sexual preferences. It's people that we love and people who love us. that's universal. We do the same things. We celebrate birthdays, we have anniversaries, we bring family gathering together for all sorts of things. And it's the importance of that every day that really is what we want to focus on, because that gets overlooked. But that, every single day, every single person going about their lives, doing their daily thing, is contributing in one way or another to the overarching culture and society that we are all a part of.
That's our program for today. Go to AmericanBlackJournal.org for more information on our guests and to check out past episodes. You can always connect with us on Facebook and on Twitter. We'll see you next time.
MASCO Corporation is proud to manufacture innovative and environmentally friendly products for the home. Delta faucets, craft-made in Merillat cabinets, and Behr brand paints have all been designed with you in mind. MASCO and its family of companies, serving Michigan communities since 1929.
Support also provided by the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, a partner with communities where children come first. The Cynthia and Edsel Ford Fund for Journalism at Detroit Public TV.
The DTE Foundation proudly supports 50 years of American Black Journal in covering African American history, culture, and politics. The DTE Foundation and American Black Journal, partners in presenting African American perspectives about our communities and in our world.
Also brought to you by Ally, Nissan Foundation, and viewers like you. Thank you.